So excited to welcome everyone tonight to a very special virtual event, Natural Observers, a conversation at the intersection of art and science. My name is Holly Menninger, and I am the executive director of the Bell Museum, and I'll be your host this evening. We are so pleased to be partnering with the College of Biological Sciences, both for tonight's event, as well as for our special exhibition that we have at the Bell Museum, an exhibition called Curious Allies, Exploring Relationships in Fungi, Parasites, and Carnivores. In that exhibit, we feature many live plant specimens from the College of Biological Sciences Conservatory. So you'll want to make sure that you check that exhibit out. In fact, Curious Allies will be on display at the Bell through January 4th, and it features exquisite botanical illustrations from artists from around the world and highlights the role of symbiosis in sustaining fungi, lichen, and plants. The exhibition showcases beautiful artworks that emerge from the careful and close observation of our natural world. In fact, observing and documenting nature through sketching, painting, and illustration is not just a contemporary practice, but part of a long tradition in science going back centuries. Our panel this evening will offer insights about the science and ecological relationships on display in Curious Allies, and we'll discuss the role of early naturalists in illuminating this world. We'll explore the intersections of close observation, ways of knowing, and what it means to share observations observations about nature through art. As we consider those questions and practices to help us better understand nature and the world around us, I want to take a moment to ground ourselves in place. The Bell Museum, where I sit this evening, the University of Minnesota, and indeed the Twin Cities sit on Dakota land. This is land reserved in treaties and still important to Dakota people today. I would also like to acknowledge the Ojibwe people, traditional keepers of lands to our north. Dakota and Ojibwe knowledge systems are crucial ways of knowing this place that we call Minnesota, the sky, the land, the waters, the wild, and the plant life. At the Bell Museum, we value the people and the communities that protect Indigenous knowledge systems, and we seek ways to support them in their work. One small way we hope to do that is through our Indigenous admissions policy. In honor of the Dakota people, we extend free admission to our museum galleries and planetarium to all Indigenous people. Our Bell team also works in close partnership with Native-led organizations, Native elders and knowledge keepers, educators, first language speakers and scholars, and artists to develop programs that center and support Native American perspectives and knowledge. I encourage you to visit the Bell Museum website or connect with our staff next time you visit to learn more. Tonight, we have an exciting lineup of guests. I might ask those guests to pop onto camera so you can see what they look like. Our program will begin with short presentations to set us up for an engaging conversation. We'll start with The Science of Symbiosis by Dr. Daniel Stanton, followed by an examination of the history of naturalists using art to advance science with Dr. Charlie Willis. I don't know if I see their faces here. Daniel, I see you. And then finally, we'll consider ways to integrate art into one's science practice with Dr. Jennifer Powers. While we'll hold our time for conversation and questions until after the presentations, please feel free to use the Q&A function in the bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit and upvote your questions. You may also find under I see it on my screen with more, click on that to click on captions if those would be helpful for you. So first, let's welcome our first speaker, Dr. Daniel Stanton. Daniel is an assistant professor in ecology, evolution, and behavior. His research focuses on the unusual plants and their allies that live in challenging places. I think we'll hear about some of those, from high tropical mountains to urban sidewalks. He sees collaborations between artists and scientists as an essential part of how we explore what is not possible. So, Daniel, take it away.
All right. Well, let me just sort of get everything set up. And thank you all for coming out tonight. Sorry, as Holly said, thank you for that introduction. My name's Daniel Stanton. I'm in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, Behavior, but I've also have a long history of association with the Bell Museum and working with helping with the collections. And what I'm here to start you off on is thinking about some of the science, the botany of the plants that are in these exhibits and the fungi. And one of the things I really like about this exhibit is that often when we talk about botanical art, we tend to think about flowers. And who doesn't love beautiful flowers? I get excited about them. But what's featured here is a whole other set of plants and fungi and relationships that don't always get the same attention in botanical art, but deserve just as much. And I wanted to like sort of spend some time thinking about like what ties them all together and why do we have this assortment of plants and other organisms that we do? And a big piece of this is this idea in part of symbiosis and of organisms living together. But I want to sort of start us off with a unifying theme for this. And it's not just because it's about dinner time, but I want to think about like food and what makes us up as organisms. And it's sort of like a maybe an obvious statement, but all organisms are made out of sort of standard chemical building blocks. All of our tissues are made out of mostly the same across all of life. And oh, it's not quite clear, but the elements that are needed are things like carbon and oxygen and nitrogen, and they're needed in particular amounts for each different organism. And this is a big piece of how I think about the world and how organisms operate within it. And it's actually a guiding piece of how we can see these relationships and connections in this art that we're talking about in this exhibit. Relationships between organisms, kind of in food or in nutrition. This is different than when we think about flowers, where often it's about moving pollen, or with fruits, where what the plant is getting is transport. Animals come and take something and move it to other places. These relationships are entirely nutrition based, and they come out of a couple sort of general thoughts. All organisms, all life on Earth is built heavily out of carbon. And plants and algae can take it from the air through photosynthesis. And so they have an easy source of carbon. But other organisms like fungi and animals need to find other ways of getting their carbon. And we'll start with that piece, and then we'll move on to thinking about the fact that organisms need nitrogen and phosphorus and some of these other components as well. So if we start with carbon, plants and algae know how to get their carbon. This is easy. But fungi and animals have to find it elsewhere. And fungi, one of the ways they can do it is they can get carbon from dead matter. And some of the images in this exhibit illustrate that. This is what's known in sort of a scientific terminology as saprotrophs. It's off of Greek roots of sapro, which literally means rot or rotten, and troph for trophine for eating. And so this could be eating fruits the way this mold is, or breaking down old wood and dead matter to recover that. And this is one of the kind of superpowers that fungi themselves tend to have. So this is one piece of things. This is one source of carbon, is things that used to be living. What? I can't. But no longer are. But this is one subset. The rest of the exhibits, rest of the ones here, are getting carbon in other ways. And this is where things get really interesting. So fungi, one of the key ways is that they can get carbon from living partners, from plants. And this is what are known as mycorrhizae. And again, I'm just going to keep breaking down these Greek roots because the terminology can be overwhelming, but there's a lot of really neat things to unpack here. So these are fungus, myco, and rhizae for roots. And these are associations in which the fungi are receiving carbon from the roots of plants, whether it's trees or other kinds of plants, up and using that as their source of carbon. And that can happen with large plants, and we call it mycorrhizae, when the photosynthetic partner, that living partner that's trading off carbon, is smaller. And things like algae or cyanobacteria, which you might think of as blue-green algae, then we get the situation of lichens, where most of what we see is actually fungus wrapped around algae. And there's a number of, this is sort of the core of some of my own research. And I want to like unpack that because it's maybe one of the less visible things. If with a lichen like this illustration here of a lungwort, if you took a sliver of that and you sliced it and you put it under the microscope, it would look something like this cartoon. Maybe not with not the smiley faces, but otherwise like this, where we have this fungal structure. That's what we see from the outside, but it's closely interwoven around algae, and in this one, also some blue-green algae or cyanobacteria that are them, and these are photosynthesizing and releasing sugars that get taken up by the fungus. And so it's similar to mycorrhizae in that it's fungus receiving carbon from a plant or a photosynthesizer. It's just the size differences is what's switched. Rather than getting it through roots, in this case, it's enveloping and creating the whole structure. So that's sort of one side of this relationship. We think of these organisms needing that carbon from plants, and a lot of the fungal illustrations here are about this and this piece of the relationship. And some of it is through breaking down dead matter, but a lot of it is about these close relationships that organisms build to acquire what they need in life. And we talked about the fungal side, but that's only one half of this relationship. When these fungi are receiving carbon, they're not necessarily getting it for free. They're trading it with the plants in exchange for things that the plants themselves are not as good as the fungi at getting. And so that can be nitrogen and phosphorus, that the hyphae, the filaments that make up fungi, are much better than plant roots at mining out of the soil or pulling out of dead matter. And so this same relationship seen from the plant side is also about acquiring food, but it's acquiring a different food stuff. It's a piece of the trade there. And they can trade with fungi. One of the other ways is essentially trading with animals. And a couple of the illustrations and some of the live examples in the exhibit focus on ones that do that. We have these ant plants that create safe spaces where ants can come in and basically live within them and excrete within them. And we don't necessarily think of that as clean, but they're trading they're sort of by housing these ants, they get their waste products, and they're getting a situation where they're getting nutrition from providing this ant with protection. This Dischidia here is maybe not as obvious as this large, weird, lumpy ant house, but is also an ant plant. It creates these smaller structures within the leaves in which ants can come in and live. And in exchange, basically, by living in there, their waste products become direct manure use for the plants. And some plants like this, but some of them, rather than doing it as an exchange or as a trade, have kind of skipped the trade part and gone straight to just eating the animal. And there's a whole set of really fantastic carnivorous plants. And this is something that plants have evolved multiple times independently to try to do. From pitcher plants, like the ones that we have here in Minnesota, or the only very distantly related tropical pitcher plants here, or sundews, where we have some in Minnesota, but also there's a tremendous diversity around the world. And so they might move to just eat the animal, or in a few cases, things that we thought were structures that were entirely for eating the animal turn out to also be about waste collection. I like this one because it's one of my favorite sort of plant-animal interactions, where they've realized that most pitcher plants feed directly off of animals as prey, but this one species of pitcher plants in the highlands in Borneo actually serves as a latrine for tree shrews, and it's got tasty surfaces in here. The tree shrew comes and licks it, and while it's sitting there, it basically uses this as a toilet, and that is the exchange. And so we've gone back from a carnivory back into a waste product for in exchange for tasty sugar to feed on. All right. And so that's plants taking advantage of fungi and animals. There's some added pieces here that can go into play as well. Rather than feeding off of animal waste, a whole set of plants have figured out instead of trading, they take their food from another plant. And these are what we might term parasites. And so I broke down Greek roots for everything else. In this case, I was looking it up, and it literally means eats another's food or sits at another's table. And so we get things like this mistletoe that is here feeding off of the phloem, off of the sugars and the tissues of this plant that it's growing on. And it's managing to have flowers and a look that looks almost the same as its host plant. And this can happen above ground with like the mistletoes that we know, or some of them do it below ground with their roots and attach on. Um, and this is one of my favorite illustrations. It's hard to pick a favorite within this art show, but this is one of my favorites because it specifically shows us not only the above ground, but the below ground relationships that are at play here, which is something that you can't easily see in nature, but really pops beautifully in the art and in this artist's rendition of it. All right, so there's parasitism and another set of plants, and they're particularly well featured in this. Rather than parasitizing other plants directly, they have taken a relationship with fungi, this mycorrhizal relationship, and we don't entirely know how they do this, but rather than trading with the fungus, they simply use it as a source of food. And so they've somehow tricked the fungi into feeding them not just more nitrogen and phosphorus, but also the carbon that they would have otherwise gotten through photosynthesis. And so we get things like this snow plant, or you might have seen these ghost pipes around here in Minnesota. These are ones that are exploiting the relationship with fungi to drive things. And because they can rely on the fungus entirely for food, they don't need to photosynthesize. And so they're no longer bound to make leaves or have green color. They become these weird other colors. And a piece of that I want to reflect on is that this ties us back to this shift from maybe partnering with the fungus and exchanging things into taking advantage of it, or at least as far as we understand, is that a lot of these relationships aren't just some perfectly fixed thing in space and time, but rather they're part of a spectrum of interactions. Whereas when two species interact, they might both benefit, or they might both suffer from it, or one might benefit and the other one suffer, but the organisms, depending on time through evolution, maybe even just depending on the year in some cases, can shift in these relationships between these spaces. They don't have to be fixed, even if we want to put them into these bins. All right. And a last closing theme on this is that one of the things that's really neat to me from especially these parasitic and what we call mycoheterotrophic plants, the ones that parasitize other plants or parasitize, essentially feed off of fungi, is that because they don't need to photosynthesize for their carbon anymore, they don't have to be green, and they don't have to produce the same structures that most plants do. Most plants have to make leaves because leaves are a good way of capturing sunlight and photosynthesizing. Instead, these plants become focused entirely on whatever they need to attract pollinators to just do their reproduction. And so we get some of the weirdest looking plants out there, and things like this plant that's ending up looking almost the same as this fungus because it's no longer bound to act what we think of as plant-like. And this relationship, this sort of ties us back into organisms and their shapes, and part of their shape relates them to how they're functioning in their environment. And this is sort of part of the roots of our science and understanding of things, but it's also one of my ways to tie this into a stream of how we think about this tied into art. Because some of the early, sort of modern, early 1800s work that really shaped some of our field of thinking about the relationships between plant form and their function and environment came from this fellow, Alexander von Humboldt. And he's got this wonderful essay in which he lays out the different ways that major growth forms of plants and how they might relate to different environments and environmental conditions. And when he wrote it in the early 1800s, he doesn't frame it as a guide for botanists or for scientists. Instead, it's framed as a guide for artists. It's framed with in responding to artists who are painting plants of landscapes that they've never been in, but they're hearing about and reading about in books. And he wanted to give them opportunities to understand how this might fit better to be able to move forward. And so the root of some of my own sort of scientific field is directly in this interface between art and science. And I think we'll hear more about Alexander von Humboldt as we go through.
Thank you, Daniel, for that walk through the science. I'm so grateful that you included so many of the works from the Curious Allies show. So thank you for showcasing those throughout your talk. And I'd be remiss if I didn't let folks know that how that show was organized and how it came to the Bell Museum. So it's the fifth New York Botanical Gardens Triennial. That's a lot of words there, but a show organized every 3 years with the American Society of Botanical Artists. And so an important part of how that show came to be and how we're able to display it at the Bell Museum. So thank you. All right. Now it's time for everyone to meet Dr. Charlie Willis. Charlie is a teaching associate professor in the Department of Biology, Teaching, and Learning. His research focuses on improving online learning, exploring the role of artificial intelligence in higher ed, and making genetics curricula more inclusive and effective. He also teaches a course on the intersection of art and science, examining how artistic practices have shaped scientific discovery and how they can enrich biology education. The floor is yours, Charlie. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Holly. I'm going to share my screen here to get started. And hopefully you can all see that. Yeah, thanks, Holly. Thanks, the Bell Museum, for having us here. Thanks, Daniel, for setting me up with an introduction to von Humboldt so we can talk a little bit more about history. Before I get into my talk, I want to give you a little bit of background of where I'm coming from with some of the ideas I'm going to be sharing. My background is in botany. I'm actually trained as an evolutionary plant biologist, and I transitioned into education. And so I came to this intersection of art and science to learn more about ways we can help students, especially non-major students, people who aren't necessarily coming to biology, to learn biology other than because they have to get more excited about it. And that's something Jennifer is going to talk to you about in detail. But that is where I kind of came to understand or to be interested in more of the history of where this intersection comes from. And so I'm going to share some of the things I've been learning about and interested in. If I can get it to advance, there we go. I want to kind of start with a basic idea that botanical illustration is about communication. Science as a field is a field for developing knowledge and ideas and understanding the world. So is art, right? And botanical illustration is kind of the perfect combination of those two things. What I'm going to talk about today is how our relationship with nature and how we communicate nature through illustration, through art, has changed over time based on social, economic, and technological conditions. And so just to get things going, let's look at the first published flora that we know of, the oldest published flora. I shouldn't say the first. Who knows when the first one was. But this is the oldest one we have. And it was originally written in Rome by a Greek philosopher, Dioscorides. And it was a medicinal text teaching people about how to use plants to treat ailments. And it was published in the 6th century, and it has been in circulation since then. And it was the predominant source of botanical information for most of medieval Europe and the Middle East. That was until the 15th century and late 15th century, when these books, we call them herbals, they're kind of like floral guides for practical purposes, started to become much more popular. And that was because of the invention of the printing press. This technology allowed us to not simply hand copy these things, but to produce them in mass, so to speak, and spread them around more openly, and not typically just in Latin, but in other languages as well. And so like that original publication I mentioned, the Merita Medica, a lot of these early herbals focused on the practical implications of practical uses of plants. And so here's just an example by a pseudonym named Macer floridus, talking about onions, or actually I think this is garlic. And its uses, how they can use it to treat certain ailments. There's a little bit of information how you can grow it, but I want to point out here that the illustration is very basic, and it's that way because it was done with a wood cutting. And so that was a technological limitation in terms of what they could convey or present. And so they had to choose wisely what aspects of the plant they were sharing. Most of these early herbals did not talk about how these plants interacted with their environment. Other than that, they might give some advice on how to grow them to the people who needed to have them available for medicinal purposes. They weren't interested in the ecology or the biology in the way that we think of it today. Here's another illustration that comes a little bit later, and this is a little bit more detailed. And I like to point it out because it's emphasizing what they were focusing on as botanical illustrators at this time, and that was detail. This is by a botanist named Leonard Fuchs from Germany, and he emphasizes that the point of these illustrations is to be as absolutely correct in the representation of the plant they're showing, which you'll see in a lot of illustrations in the exhibit, right? They're trying to, in a sense, they're abstractions, but they're also representations almost in a heightened sense of what this plant looks like. And it's showing you oftentimes more than you can see in a photo, certainly, but even sometimes in an individual plant in real life, because they're showing you different stages of that plant and highlighted in different ways. So they're technical, but they're technical for a purpose. And I tried to find some examples of species interactions because that's the thesis of this exhibit. The best I could do for this time were examples of herbals talking about how certain plants were beneficial for bees in relationship to honey production. So this is a French botanist, Jacques Delechamps. This whole book, Historia Generale de Plants, talks a lot about bees. It's this plant, bees love this plant, bees don't like this plant could kill bees, this plant's good for bees, but it might be hard to grow. This is an example of heather. He's like, apiarists love heather because bees love it and it's easy to grow. So this is the best example of the earliest interspecies interaction I could find, which is pollination, but they didn't know about pollination. They weren't talking about it in that sense. They were talking about it in terms of honey. So technologies change. These herbals are popular. And what comes next is an innovation in printing, which is copper plating. And that allows botanists, these printers, and the artists working with them, sometimes they're all the same people, to share much more detail of the plants they're working with. And so you can see this is a much more detailed illustration of this Canea indica than those wood blocks I showed earlier, or even that Leonard Fuchs drawing, which I believe was a copper plating, but this is a much more refined technique of that. And so here you're seeing a more modern representation of a botanical illustration, the detail, the composition, breaking the plant apart and arranging it in a way that highlights key aspects of its anatomy. It's also highlighting key aspects of its life history, its flowering, its fruiting at the same time, and arranged not like you to see it in nature, but in a way that would allow you to identify it if you were looking for it in nature. And just to highlight an example of something similar you might see in the exhibit, here's one of an orchid. This is a microheterotrophic orchid, so it feeds off of another plant. It's non-photosynthetic, but it's showing you this orchid at different stages of its life, flowering, fruiting, and the seed pods. So that's something a botanical illustrator can do that a photographer can't easily do, right? You can capture a lot more information about a plant in a drawing than you could in a single photograph. And so technology is allowing them to express more information, catalog more information, communicate more about the world around them. This is a famous herbal from around this time, Hortus astensius. It's German. I'm not going to try to pronounce the German. But the thing that made this such a big deal was that it wasn't just black and white, it was in color, and it was in vivid, bright color. And so innovations in printing allowed for the publication of these big, beautiful floras now, right? Herbals less so because they're less practical, but they're more focused on the aesthetic of the plant. And that's changing how people, that's a reflection of how people are changing their interaction with plants. So we're going away from that direct need to have a practical relationship with plants to treating them almost as emblems of wealth and status. And so this is the same time that we see like tulip mania in Europe. And these floras were similarly highly valued commodities amongst the wealthy to illustrate how much they could afford and show off. And so botany became almost a status symbol, which is again reflected in the illustrations. And that coincides with the wealth coming in to Europe, which also came with a lot of new plants and animals to understand and explain and relate to what they saw in Europe itself. And so botanical illustration, botanical art reflects that change. This is an illustration from a French botanist, Charles Plumer, who went on several expeditions to the West Indies, French colonies there, and drew these incredible composite images of plants he was observing. And I like to show this because it's an illustration not just of the plants, but of their ecology. It's showing you not just what they look like, but where they lived and how they interacted. And so that wasn't necessarily his intention. Again, he's trying to document diversity, but he's doing it in a way that's starting to bring in these broader ideas that we think of as more modern biological concepts. And you'll see an example of this. This is the title slide for today's talk, right? Zoomed out. It's showing you these really stylized versions of each one of these species, lichens, mushrooms, ferns, trees, all growing together. Not a world that really exists, but also one that tells you a lot about the real world, which I think is so fascinating about botanical illustration, is it's that hyper stylization can actually be more informative sometimes than a static photo or even a written description. So botany starts to transition away from being purely practical and medicinal to being a field of inquiry into itself, along with the scientific revolution. It's a field that's trying to establish itself as important beyond just growing herbs to help treat coughs and colds. And this was exemplified by the growing field of taxonomy, which was trying to organize all life on Earth, including plants. And plants were actually a big focus of Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy. And he used illustration a lot to show how different plants were related structurally. So he was drawing the structures, pulling out pieces to highlight their relationships. Funny note, Linnaeus was derided by his peers in school as being a terrible artist. And he in turn dismissed botanical illustration as being too highfalutin and said you should focus on the structure and try to convey that as simply as possible. So he had an interesting tension with art, perhaps a little bit of psychology there. I wanted to point out this mistletoe that Daniel showed, just because it's highlighting structure and pulling out pieces of a plant, zooming in on them, showing you detail that you just can't get in real life, right? That's the beautiful thing about botanical illustration, is it's conveying so much information in such a small space. Microscopes added a layer to this, and I just wanted to show this because these are really cool drawings from Robert Hooker's initial publication, Microbial, showing his drawings of cells of plants. This is a plant leaf, and the detail he's giving to each one of these cells, totally different view of how plants were and worked, right? You'll see an example of this in the exhibit. These aren't microscopic zoomed in illustrations of these different fungi, but they're zoomed in and they're highlighting key features in a detailed way. Again, something you can only do in a drawing. And one of my favorite pieces in the whole exhibit was this moonglow lichen, which looks almost like an abstract piece. And if you zoom in, and this is a little blurry, but I encourage you to look at this when you go to the exhibit and just look at the detail and effort they're putting in drawing these little cells. The same thing with Hooker. You're trying to convey real information, be as realistic and representational as you possibly can. They're not just drawing little circles. And that is one of the kind of the key things about botanical illustration is it's trying to present the world as it is, even while being art, while being stylized. So as natural history becomes more of a common feature of botanical illustrations or showing more ecology, you start to see kind of an expansion of what's included in floras. And that's highlighted by Maria Sabella's Marin's work on plant-insect interactions and insect morphogenesis, and just showing the world that these plants lived in, not just the plants themselves. I think Jennifer will talk a little bit more about her. There's a really great exhibit about her, though, at the Arboretum, if you want to learn more about her. And I'll just highlight that piece that Daniel pointed to, because it's, again, showing relationships of insects with plants. In this case, this is a plant-pollinated parasitic plant. It's a fly-pollinated parasitic plant, with an unusual combination to see there. Then finally, we reach the golden era of the artist-scientist. This is encapsulated by Humboldt himself, who used art as a way to explore and hypothesize and understand the world around him. It wasn't now simply a tool for communication, that was critical, but it was a part of the process of scientific knowledge. And he spoke of art as a necessary piece to what he called the unity of the natural world. You couldn't understand the natural world unless you considered it with an artistic perspective. And so he saw them not as separate, but as fully integrated ways of knowing, as building knowledge. And two of his proteges, one was Charles Darwin, who read Humboldt obsessively when he was riding around on the Beagle and drew obsessively as a result. He took from that message from Humboldt to the heart and constantly was sketching illustrations and anatomical sketches and diagrams and conceptual models of what he was how he was trying to explain the world around him. Another person who was a big fan of Humboldt and Darwin, because he came after Darwin, was Ernst Haeckel, a very famous artist. And he talked about how he couldn't understand the natural world simply through reading words. He had to draw it. He had to use images to understand and memorize the world around him. And so we kind of move away from that as technology takes us away from the need to draw these things and to print those drawings, especially in the modern era. And so it feels as if this is antiquated, but the reality is the modern understanding of the natural world that began with Darwin and ecology with Humboldt was predicated on an artistic observation of the natural world. And so I'll just end with carnivorous plants. Daniel mentioned them. They're so cool. Here are the drawings Darwin did for his publication on insectivorous plants. He studied them obsessively. This is Drosera. This is a drawing on the left of him feeding Drosera pieces of meat and trying to illustrate its reaction to that. He would feed it different things and see if it could digest it. He did these detailed illustrations. He did different angles. It's just kind of the perfect encapsulation of all these techniques that were coming into play at the peak of this kind of artist-scientist era. And Daniel showed the same one, but I encourage you to check it out. There's lots of carnivorous plants. Here's a Drosera as well, showing you Drosera in the real world, right? Abstracted, but doing what it does, eating little insects, wilting, growing new fronds, all of these things. It's a living representation of that plant. And that's really what art can do, is convey that knowledge in such a simple and powerful way. And that's where I'll end. That's what I have to say. So I'll pass it on to Jennifer to talk about.
Thank you so much, Charlie. That was a great overview of that history. And I just want to remind our audience tonight that as questions are popping into your head, please feel free to use the Q&A function in the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We welcome you to seed some questions in there for us to get started after we finish our last presentation. So last but not least in the lineup of presentations, we have Dr. Jennifer Powers. Jennifer is a professor in the Department of Plant and Microbial Biology. She is a forest ecologist who studies seasonally dry tropical forests. She believes that art and ecology exist in a mutualistic relationship. Remember that big graph that Daniel showed us, and incorporates artistic practice into her classes on botany and nature journaling. So Jennifer, we'll let you take it away.
Well, let me try. I was trying to get, so let me see here. I'm just gonna bring up my slides. Okay. Um, Sorry about this. Okay, you can see my slides?
Yes, we can. Rock and
Great.
roll.
Thanks. Okay. See here. I just want to make sure we're staying on time. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you everyone for participating. This is such a fun event. And Charlie, I learned a lot from both Daniel and Charlie, but I'm gonna start by trying to convince you that the golden era of the scientist artist is coming back full circle. I think Charlie sort of spoke about von Humboldt as embodying that. I'd like to think that we're moving back into that era. But I wanted to start with these cave paintings from Lascaux in France. You may be familiar with these. These are estimated to be 17,000 years old. And why I like to start with this because these cave paintings, which have been found on different continents, just illustrate that we have always been observing and documenting our observations of nature. So it's part of our DNA, I would say. So when I was in grad school many years ago, I was told that you could be a scientist or you could be an artist, that these were mutually exclusive. But the older I get, the more I'm starting to realize and appreciate that it's not science or art, it's science and art. So I have three simple messages that I want to try to convince you of tonight. One of those is that science and art are a mutualism. So Daniel talked about how a mutualism is one of these win-win interactions between different organisms. I think science and art are a mutualism. The second point I want to make is that botanical artists are profound natural historians. I think through all of the works that we've seen today, and the works that you can see at the Bell, that's really obvious. But I want to emphasize it. And last, I want to finish by trying to convince you that practicing art makes you a better scientist. So those are my three messages. So this is von Humboldt, of course, the Prussian polymath explorer. He's considered the father of biogeography. So we've heard a lot about him. And so this is how I start with my students. I ask them, so von Humboldt on his expeditions and his travels, how did he let people know about what he was seeing? As he saw these amazing plants, these incredible landscapes, how did he document his experiences to try to tell the people when he returned back to Europe what he had seen? Did he use his device? No. Back in von Humboldt's time, if you wanted to document your experiences and what you saw, you could do it through writing, you could tell people what you saw, or you could do it through drawing. And in fact, von Humboldt and the way that he conceptualized and then visualize the ideas about what he was seeing as he was traveling through Ecuador profoundly transformed our understanding of science. So this is a map that he illustrated of Chimborazo, the volcano. And what he's done here is try to understand how the plant species that you find change as you move up in elevation. So he's boiling down a lot of these ideas, and he's presenting them in this graphical format, which really profoundly changed how we understand biogeography and organisms' distributions. And again, so Sibila, Marian, I just bring this up to show that, and really echo what Charlie said, is that the history of botany has been intricately intertwined with art. I think these illustrations that she did, which document insects throughout their entire developmental sequence, from instars, from larvae, all the way to things like butterflies and their host plants, this really revolutionized our understanding of life cycles of insects. And as we've sort of moved on or moved away from what Charlie called the golden era of artists and of the artist scientist, as scientists, we've become much more pigeonholed and specialized. We have expanded our vocabulary of jargon and our field specific vocabularies. At the same time, I think we've really minimized our visual vocabularies, and this is something that I see in my own training, and what I was taught when I was a student. But happily, I think we're starting to come full circle and appreciate how engaging visuals and art are really a pathway for better communicating science. So I really think, hopefully, we're coming full circle, and the golden age of the artist scientist will come again. And this is just a really recent paper that I handled as an editor, where Lindsay McCullough and her colleagues worked with a student artist, an undergraduate, who designed these really beautiful figures that I think are just really engaging. You see something like this, and you just want to know more about what they're talking about. And this figure appeared in a peer-reviewed scientific paper. Similarly, this is a paper this is a figure that appeared in a paper from some colleagues where Christina Anderson Tejera did these beautiful watercolors to illustrate disturbance regimes. So these are things that you could maybe do in PowerPoint, but when you do it in art, you have the ability to really focus in and curate what ideas you want to communicate. In this case, disturbance regimes, fire and storms. So now I want to sort of pull the conversation back and emphasize how botanical artists are scientists in their own right. So this is one of the works in the exhibit by Rhonda Dick, and it's a collection of fungi and lichens and bryophytes, and I think it's spectacularly beautiful, but also it reveals a profound understanding of these organisms, how to curate a collection of these organisms, how to focus on the details while also appreciating the big picture. And I think this is something that this type of art can do. So, to my last point, doing art helps you be a better scientist. So I don't have a background in art, but I do like doing art. And so in around 2021, I started bringing art supplies with me to the field when I was doing my field research and jotting down pictures of plants, pictures of animals, what I saw as I was doing science. And what I learned was that that doing art, drawing these organisms that I was encountering made me a better scientist. It makes me observe these organisms more. It makes me slow down and really focus on the details. So I think as a scientist, doing art or using an artistic practice has really helped me be a better scientist. I also think it's this sort of approach I've used in my classes uh, to provide students with a pathway for engaging botany. So these are two pages out of botanical journals that two of my students this semester in botany have done. So all of my students, they do a personal botanical journal, their PBJ. And as part of this assignment, they have to do a hand drawing of whatever organism they're looking at. And I do this in part because it's a chat GPT proof assignment, but also I think, and it's really clear from looking at these pictures, that by drawing, they are learning a lot more about these organisms than if they were just cutting and pasting photos out of Wikipedia. And there's a name for this practice now, nature journaling. It's an artistic practice or sort of meditational practice in a lot of ways that combines art and science for deep observation. And these are just a couple of pages from my nature journals. And I've taught nature journaling as a freshman seminar. And I just want to sort of finish with this image from a student of mine, Ethan Lai, who was clearly a fantastic artist. But what really impresses me about this particular page out of his nature journaling is you can see how he's trying to understand how a squirrel works. He's trying to understand how squirrels move by drawing do they push off with their front legs? Do they push off with their back legs? What is the role of the tail? You can see this illustrated through this series of steps that he's drawing, and he's using art as a way to help him understand motion of animals. And I find that really profound. So back full circle. I hope that in a brief discussion, I've been able to convince you that art and science are a mutualism. And people who are artists can also be scientists. People who are scientists can also use art. Botanical artists are profound natural historians, and I think that's really on a display in this exhibit. And last, practicing art makes you a better scientist. And so with that, my last slide is just to invite you all, if you're interested in nature journaling, I teach it at Itasca through the craft school at the Itasca Biological Station in the summers. So consider joining us at Itasca to learn more about nature journaling. So with that, I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's awesome. And we'll make sure we post some links
Oh, great.
and broadcast those. Maybe Steph and Christy, you can pull those up and share those up with everybody as while we're doing our conversation here. So I want to remind folks, I've already seen some people have put their questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to invite Charlie and Daniel to come back on screen, because we're going to have a conversation. And I think I'd like to start with the question with your premise, Jennifer, that art makes you a better scientist. So Daniel and Charlie, I'm going to put you in the hot seat. We already know what Jennifer's artistic practice is. I want to hear if you have them, or perhaps if you don't feel like, or maybe how you document your observations in some kind of visual way. So please come off. You don't have to stay muted. Let's hear if you engage in any artistic practice related to your science.
Yeah, I really have picked it up as a product of looking into it as a way to make my students more engaged. And so I never really did it as an actual practicing scientist, in part because it was never really taught to me as a tool to use to better my science. It was kind of always presented as maybe a hobby, or you might do it if you're kind of interested in it, but it was never said like you should do this. This should be part of the practice of observation and documentation, whether it's in the lab or in the field. So it's new to me in a very real way, and it's been very fun to kind of rediscover it and think about how it's helped me understand things better.
Daniel, what about you?
My drafting skills are really limited. Um, and so I have not done a whole lot of like visual art tied. I've done a bit and I've used it at times as a way to almost go the opposite direction rather than like focusing on the details to sort of think about abstracting out what are like the core, what's like the core essence of different shapes of organisms and how I can sort of abstract out from the details. For full disclosure, like my father is a visual artist and is a sculptor, and so I grew up immersed in a whole lot of that, but just never worked on like the direct skills myself. But if we broaden that out, I do think a whole lot about verbal art in a sense and language, and I've been doing a lot of collaborations with artists that are focused on like conceptual art and thinking. And so if we move outside of verbal art, then it has been a bigger, much bigger piece sorry, outside of visual art, a much bigger piece of what I do.
That's funny.
Jennifer, related, like if one what tools do you recommend for someone getting started in the like should you dive into watercolors right away or is it just like start with a paper and pen? Like what how do you suggest, because I think the hardest part probably is just doing it. Um
Yeah, make it a daily practice is what I would say. And I would also recommend to go simple. The you know, you won't what I prize or what I prioritize in art tools are things that are portable because then I'll take them with me and go outside. So I like a small notebook, I like a pencil, a pen and watercolors or colored pencils. But I think starting small and really getting into a practice. I think that's one of the benefits of it is that you don't need a lot of fancy, expensive equipment. You need literally just a pencil and a notebook, and you can start.
yeah.
Yeah.
I was heartened to see your examples from scientific journals and publications that had illustrations and images in it, and that's becoming more of a thing.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a harder sell? Because I also think about some fields, the inclusion of art and scientific publications is part of practice. Like I'm thinking about paleontology and when
Yeah.
there's a new dinosaur, right? Now that's not based on observation, it's inferred from structures of the natural world, but that's just a regular part of that practice. Do you see, particularly with so many journals going online, that it's becoming more normalized to include art and illustrations as part of publications?
I personally do. Yeah, I can't think of any paper I read at all when I was in grad school that had anything like that. And I see it much more over the last 5, 10 years. I think people are really it's a lot easier to integrate art because papers now come out on online journals. So you used to have to pay a lot for a colored plate, no longer. And I think there's just a push towards making science more accessible through things like graphical abstracts. And that, yeah, I really do think that we are kind of coming full circle. And not only is it fun and helps you communicate science better, I think it's being used what the way I see it in journal articles is art being used to really accentuate the science.
Yeah, that's great. I'm kind of toggling back and forth between the Q&A online and then some of my own questions because that's the host prerogative. But I see that Marilyn Garver has a question. She notes what seems to be missing is teaching students basic drawing skills. So she's wondering, will you offer this in your botany programs, or do you see space or room for that within sort of the academic training programs?
I
Great
so
question. Yeah, Charlie, you go.
yeah.
Mm.
So as an elective, yes, right. That's like the freshman seminar I teach, and Jennifer teaches botany. I think can speak more to her integration there. And I'm doing that in a non-majors biology class. So when and where I can, I do, but that like just basic practice as part of a say graduate student's curriculum or a biology major's curriculum is is certainly not there yet. It's the kind of a theme that we've been pushing, right? Because drawing is a way of learning in and of itself, whether it's biology, botany, whatever. It's been a shown, demonstrated way to improve learning outcomes. And so that's partly how I'm selling it to people in my field, in my department, and trying to promote it as a piece of the overall curriculum, especially in biology majors, where art is often sidetracked or it's the othered, put it mildly.
Jennifer or Daniels, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Charlie really did a nice job of of articulating that. But I would also just say in the botany class that I teach, my goals in a lot of ways are to engage them. And so if they're the if it would be ideal for them to have an art class in parallel, or maybe take a little bit of time to teach some of these skills. But I'm not there yet. And I think at a minimum, I think they really do enjoy just doing the assignments. And so that to me, I'm taking the win, any way you can engage 75 undergrads in botany who are non-majors, that's a win I will take.
Yeah.
I
I
let
have
it
to,
know. Oh, go ahead, Daniel. Go ahead.
I have to say, like, I think, yeah, the training in the skills is not there, but when I took botany classes and mycology classes, we always had to draw. We had to draw pieces because that is how you both observe and you abstract. Like
Mhm.
Jennifer was saying, it just wasn't, but there wasn't sort of like a crash course in here are some drawing skills. It's just kind of a work this out as you go.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
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 And I will say,
Interesting.
That's
so we
right.
do blind contour drawing in my freshman seminar, and I do it for some incoming biology freshmen as part of this intro class I teach. But like just the basic introduction to like contour drawing or blind contour drawing, they go from, like you said, Daniel, like being almost afraid of their inability to draw to drawing something that
Mhm.
is really good. And it doesn't take a lot of skill training. It doesn't need to be a whole class on art, I feel, to get them to a point where they would be comfortable to do it more. Um,
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So Carol has a question. First, offered gratitude. Thank you for featuring our exhibition in this fascinating presentation. Oh, so Carol Wooden, yay! Thank you. We're glad that you're here. Do you have thoughts about why there is a renaissance in botanical art occurring? Why there are so many botanical artists and illustrators working now? Hypotheses.
I I love that question. I think there's a renaissance in natural history on the whole. I've seen even in my time since a grad student, like a reinvestment, you could say, uh, in like basic natural history collections and reutilizing them in new and exciting ways. And so I think from the scientific community, there's been interest in it, and that might have spurred some, resources to go to botanical artists. But yeah, that's a really good question.
I think so I'll just add on to what Charlie said, that I think in some ways so I've seen in my field definitely kind of returning to our roots in natural history. And I think some of this is sort of not a pushback or a realization that just sequencing DNA of everything doesn't necessarily get us 100% towards understanding organisms in their environment, that we need more. It's maybe necessary, but it's not sufficient if we want to understand biology. And so I sort of see the rise in practices like nature journaling, botanical art, focus and a valuing of natural history as a core part of ecology in a lot of ways as a pushback against our totally digital world. So one of the things I've noticed with my students, and when I do a lot of nature journaling with them, it's they're not on their phones. They're not checking Instagram every 15 seconds. And I think maybe this is my own person. Maybe I'm divulging too much, but we're just kind of sick of being just totally online all the time, right? And for me, just doing something in a journal with a piece of paper and a pen is a way of disengaging myself from a purely digital world. And so that is one hypothesis about this renaissance in botanical and valuing botanical art and promoting botanical art and promoting people doing their own art. I think it's sort of an antidote to our modern digital lives.
Yeah. Well, so to that end, maybe I can poke that a little bit further.
Yeah.
And like, there are digital tools. I'm thinking about, iPads with
Yeah.
things and I've seen some beautiful illustrations that are done with digital. I mean, there's a spectrum, right, of the digital tools one can use to make art. So I wonder, I'd love to hear more about your thoughts about that. I mean, I think old school pen and paper feels like the less distractions focused. But is there a place for using some of those digital tools, or do you see opportunity on the horizon?
I would say yes. I would say yes, and that it's sort of it's both. It's not and or, it's both. I think that whatever tools people use to spark their creativity, are tools that we should promote. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Well,
Someone,
oh, go ahead, Charlie. Lay it on
oh,
us.
Kathleen Garnis made a point that it might also be a reaction to the recognition that we're losing so much of the biodiversity around us, which I think is a phenomenal point. I think there's kind of a broad disconnect with nature in a modern world, partly due to digital devices, but just where we live and how we live our lives. And like wanting to re-engage with that could be a big piece of that puzzle.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to call attention because I was like, oh, that's
Yeah,
great.
thank you for calling that out. I also want to point out in the Q&A that there's a lot of love for you all. That an anonymous attendee said that they graduated with a biology major and later started doing botanical art. Personally, I've learned more through doing art than I did in college classes because we had to learn so much in a semester. The research required to do art is so important to do art correctly. I'm glad to hear that your professors are willing to include art in their teaching. Wonderful session tonight. Thank you. So and I think the really exciting and interesting part related to this is I hope folks will be able to come to the Bell Museum and to see the exhibition in person, because what we have added to the exhibition are live specimens from the College of Biological Sciences Conservatory, as well as specimens from our herbarium. So like the dried and pressed plant pieces. And as you all were talking about, zooming in and looking closely and capturing some of that detail, that I think it's a nice interplay between the illustration and the real deal. So excellent. All
And
right.
I want to comment, it's a really fun exhibition because of the very different approaches to botanical art went in it. You didn't get we went and visited, the three of us, and nerded out about a whole lot of it. But one of the things that was exciting is we'd look at one piece and be like, this is really great because it's showing these details and it's showing like below and above ground and these things. And we look at the next one. This one's great because it's not showing those details, but instead it's doing this other thing. And there's no one correct way or best way to do this illustration. Some of them are valuable because they're showing you all of these things you wouldn't see, and others are showing you a snapshot in time and having, I think it's a very nicely curated exhibit to show what these different perspectives and angles can get us. Yeah.
Yes. Point well taken. All right, folks, we are running long. Again, more interesting things. And yes, we have recorded this. We will share out with the attendees